Hello. Let's see, is it working? I think it's working. Yeah, hey, welcome. Um, yeah, well, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. We're going to get started in a little bit. Okay. There we go. Now it's working. Yeah, thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking a little bit about kind of finishing up our theme here for the month of sort of older history of way we've looked at history here in Marathon County. If you're joining us live, I got started a little late, but we're going to get started here at 12:30. So, excuse me. We'll be getting started in a couple minutes, minute or two here. And if you're joining us after the fact and watching the recording, feel free to skip ahead if you want to. I just want to thank our sponsor, Yankee Bookstore, for making it possible for us to do this, and to all of you, whether you're a member or just tune in occasionally and watch these. It's really great when we can, there's an audience for this, and so I definitely appreciate you all. And of course, the people who make it monetarily possible is always nice too. So big thanks to everyone who does that. Yankee Bookstore, as well as our members, and hey, one last pitch for the year here. If you're not already a member of the Historical Society here, the Marathon County Historical Society, it's a great way to, support programs like this, our local history, and get some fun benefits as well. So if you want to do that, marathoncountyhistory.org, or I'm sure, whatever you're watching on, there's links to that. Or you can just kind of give us a call, come on by. We're friendly. Yeah. All right. Well, I think actually we'll just get started, jump right in here. Hi. Let's see, I didn't check the volume. Hold on. Yeah, that's good. Cool. All right. So today we are talking about. So we've been looking this month at different aspects of how our local history has been explored. Whether that's the early museum exhibits, like we talked about last week at the museum, or whether it's other groups, reenactment at the log jam, walking tours. There's a lot of ways that over the years that we've engaged with history, and often through the Marathon County Historical Society, which has been sort of a focal point for a lot of this. But I wanted to also talk about before the Historical Society. How did we look at history before there was an organization that kind of just did it for us, to the extent that we do that, right? That's the idea. And then it kind of becoming a historiography, which is a term that it basically means the history of history. And it's actually, it's kind of one of my favorite aspects of things to kind of look at. If you are looking at something like the American Civil War, for example, right? This huge event in our history that's been written about over and over and over. You could just kind of repeat what happened and say this happened and this happened. But the reality is that, as time goes on, what's important changes. There's new philosophies about, what the important thing in the Civil War, like, why the North won versus the South, or the importance of this or importance of that. So by looking at the different ways that over time, we have looked at an event like, Civil War or just local history, it can actually speak a lot to the local community, or the community itself, and how we've changed and the people that do that. So I think it's a very interesting, but this actually in practice means is I looked a lot at the publications, the things that have been published to specifically speak to our history. And it kind of started with this question here of when exactly do we first document our history here in Marathon County? Which I think is an interesting and important question. Well, I don't know how important it is, but it's something that it's an interesting rhetorical kind of thought here. The first settlers started in 1839, the first sawmill that we can trace back to. We're 10 years on in 1849. Were they sitting around and going, "Hey, we should have a big shindig. We're 10 years old"? Probably not. I don't think that they were in a position. I mean, maybe they recognized it, maybe they didn't. But they certainly weren't like having a citywide celebration, in Big Bull Falls. They weren't even Wausau at that point. They certainly weren't writing it down or writing a history. But at some point, we start to do that. And so I think that when you start to do that, when you decide, hey, there's history here, we as a community have a story that we should make sure it gets told. That's kind of an important moment in any community. So when is that? And again, it's kind of rhetorical. I don't actually know for sure when they had that realization, but I do know that I think the very first publication I can find that speaks to the history of Marathon County and the people inside it is this. The 1881, it's a large book, sections on many different counties, but it's called The History of Northern Wisconsin. Well, actually, it's called The History of Northern Wisconsin, containing an account of its settlement, growth, development, and resources, an extensive sketch of its counties, cities, towns, and villages, their improvements, industries, manufactories, biographical sketches, portraits of prominent men and early settlers, views of county seats, etc. So it's kind of a wordy title. For that reason, we just call it The History of Northern Wisconsin. It's still pretty early. So a lot of the communities they're talking about haven't been around for terribly that much long. The city of Wausau became a city as a city charter in 1872. So this is less than a decade, maybe a little over a decade since then. The people who wrote this is not local though. They're not local. I actually don't know very much specifically about the Chicago-based Western Historical Company, which is the group that puts this on, that publishes this. My understanding is they would send out experts, historians, I guess, for their time, and they would go up to communities like Marathon County or Taylor County or Eau Claire or whatever, and they would learn the history, write that down, and then they would publish. They published a number of books from the late 1870s into the 1880s, mostly about Wisconsin communities, counties, Iowa, and Illinois. But yeah, I think it's an important thing. It's worth noting there had been other sources that have mentioned Marathon County in some capacity. Maybe it's one of its cities or one of its communities, but this isn't just a passing reference as a sentence or maybe a paragraph. This actually has 35 pages dedicated specifically to Marathon County. And so it gives, an overview. This is the first page here. And then it goes into detail about, here's the county seat of Wausau. Here's all of the important events that have happened, of which there were like 32. Interestingly, about half of them were a fire, a flood, or a big windstorm. So that's kind of the level of excitement that's happening here at that time. But then they talk about the local individuals and companies and sort of the way that it's organized, the history, and then they go into many of the other communities as well. It's not just Wausau, including some communities that didn't really come into being. They have a section about the up and coming city or community of Mansfield, and I don't think that actually became a thing at any point. But you never know. And I think for that, it's pretty cool. This is not just a contemporaneous, here's what's there right now. This is a book that is looking at its history. In fact, they have a section specifically dedicated to past, people who died, but that are important to the community. But it is also not something that was published locally. For that, we need to jump ahead to 1907 and Edgar E. Ladue, or Ladue. He is a resident of Mosinee, Wisconsin. And so he publishes this early and late Mosinee. So this book, it's about 230 pages long. Ladue at this point, if you put it in context, 1907, this is around the time we get the first, paper mills going in. Mosinee is changing quite considerably. So he sees this and decides, I want to write down the old stories, the stuff that's going to get lost. And some of it does. He talks a lot about Native Americans in a way that we don't see in later histories because they're, the people that are alive in, 1957 for the centennial, they don't have the experience of dealing with Native peoples. So that's kind of interesting to see. Again, you can see how by looking at the different histories, you can see what they talk about, what they don't, as representing the sort of time that they're in. So this is an important step forward. It is just Mosinee that he's talking about. For the wider county, you need to jump ahead to Louis Marchetti, the Honorable Judge Marchetti, who wrote 1913 his opus, History of Marathon County, Wisconsin, and Representative Citizens. And this is a mammoth book. It's over 1,000 pages. He doesn't just talk about his home in Wisconsin, in Wausau. He is a circuit, one of the first circuit judges. He is involved in a lot of communities personally, although he does take a tact of being very objective. We actually did a whole history chats about him earlier this year. If you're interested in knowing more about Marchetti, but his writing is very, even though he's talking about a speech that he gave 40 years ago, he has to say it in the third person. It's that sort of thing. And he tries to be objective and say, this is the county history. It's not just Wausau. He talks about all little townships, all the villages. He tries to include all of the, what is their local church? What is their business? Who are the local settlers who've started this community? And for that, it's a nice definitive history. So in terms of a history, this is kind of an important one. But there's another sort of area that the history gets written down that's worth pointing out as well. And that's things like this. So this is the special Golden Anniversary edition of the Wausau Daily Herald, or Record Herald at this point. The cover here is this wonderful piece of art incorporating the local seal and sort of a before and an after. It was designed by Jane Reed Thompson, who's a local artist. This was for the 50th anniversary of Wausau. And I want to put this in here because I think it's important to recognize, well, for a bunch of reasons, but I think that, that there's that old adage that journalism is the first draft of history. And in some cases, that's not just, contemporary events. That, in many cases, especially in smaller communities that don't have, smaller communities, it's the local paper people, local journalists who are going out and doing the research and saying, oh, this is the history of this or that. Maybe it's sort of as a human interest, or, they're talking about that expansion of the factory, and so you need to give a little context of how old it was and where it started. But however you get to that, they are often the ones that are collecting and know how to do the legwork to write a history. And so occasionally, like the 1922, for the 50th anniversary of the city of Wausau. Again, 1872 is when Wausau wasn't founded in 1872, but it got its city charter. So it went from a village to a city, which is kind of a big deal in their estimation. And so they put out this edition. And again, there's some precedent for this. I wanted to talk briefly about Wausau in 1900. This book is itself, don't have it mirrored. Okay. This book is actually a reprint. It was by Yankee Bookstore, it's actually 1887. They put this out as a compendium to. Here we go. There we go. So their book of postcards. And what this is actually a comprehensive, it's sort of a reprint of a special edition that the three major English newspapers, the Central Wisconsin, the Wausau Pilot and Review, and the Wausau Daily Record Herald, they came together and published this book in the year 1900, looking into the new century. Here's what Wausau is in this moment. And it's a really interesting book. It's not designed to be a historical source, right? It's talking, here is what is happening right now. This is why you should move here. This is the prominent men who are going to be involved in the, in the leading of our, the businessmen and politicians and all of that. Here's pictures of their houses. Here's a little about the clubs that they're involved in. It's really trying to document what is Wausau like in 1900. Which is also, so it kind of shows that there is precedent. Also, the 1922 Golden Anniversary Edition, which this is what the inside looked like for the fur cover, was kind of the basis for 50 years later, for 1972, for the actual centennial of the city of Wausau. They went all out and they had multiple, really big edition. I won't get into that specifically because that kind of came after the Historical Society for this talk, but, it's a nice pattern that gets followed. This is the actual edition that they put out in 1922. And as you can see, this is not contemporary. Here's the picture of the old, Bull Falls. Here's the old courthouse that is no longer there. Here's the bird's eye view of Wausau in 1879. A little prominent thing about the local politicians. Here's the story about how the city gets started. They're really looking at the past and trying to document the history of the community and the individual groups that are part of this. Here's the hospital, here's the school, here's local business here, local individuals. And this is a great source. for that moment. Now, it's interesting. You might wonder, earlier in 1922, there was this article. It's part of a larger article reporting on the Marathon County Agricultural Society meeting. This is the group that puts on the fair every year. And here they are recognizing in February, hey, Wausa's turning 50 as a city. Maybe there's something here. And so they propose this idea of a homecoming. And they take this idea, which basically means that they're going to invite everybody who moved away, who once lived in the Wausa area, come back for the celebration. You can get into the fair, you can have some fun there, you can reminisce. It'd be a nice sort of marketing tool to try to be a central point to get people to come home to Wausa. And they pitch this to the city council and the Chamber of Commerce, and both of them say, oh, that's a great idea. And then they defer it to a committee, and it never gets done. About a month before the actual fair, they announce they've scrapped it because just plans aren't coming together quickly enough. And then they say, well, we'll do it next year, right? So maybe not 1922, but 23, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Well, we do have a homecoming that happens, but it's not 1 year later, it's 10. This is a picture from the Marathon County Homecoming in 1932. This is the Chamber of Commerce's float in front of the county courthouse with a log cabin that was built. And the idea, again, same idea, bring everybody back to Wausa, and celebrate the people who came before, look at our own history. The log cabin was where you would go, you'd register for this event. So you'd show up and you would say, yeah, this is who how old it was since I settled here, when I was born or when I came here. And then they gave out ribbons and medals to people, if they'd been there for 20 years or 50 years, if they had come back. And I think they also gave like an award to the people that came the furthest away to return back to Wausa. Part of the incentive here, 1932 isn't a nice round 100 years since anything local happening. It's in partnership with the fair again. Part of the reason here is definitely the Great Depression, right? Getting people to come back and bring in tourism, in 32, that's not a bad idea. And it is very successful in that regard. But the actual reason why they picked 32 has nothing to do with really local history. It has everything to do with this guy. This is George Washington. And in 1932, he would have been 200 years old. And so a bunch of local people got together and thought, hey, we should have some celebration to mark this. Because obviously history, right? History is George Washington. It's the founding fathers. It's the old stuff. But then they decided to kind of turn it into a wider thing. They partnered it with the homecoming. This is a coin that was produced as sort of a reminder. It was sold by the police department and the fire department to locals as a reminder of the event coming up. And as you can see, Rib Mountain features prominently on the back. Yeah. So yeah, based on George Washington, but then as these things often do, you might think you're going back to the old history, but there's actually some relevant, important stuff here. And so as people are getting together and, registering and going to the fair, they're chatting about the good old days, and some of it gets written down, but very little of it does. But it sets an important idea in the minds of the people here. So here's lessons. Number one, a good anniversary is super helpful if you're going to have a historical celebration. Ideally something locally, but hey, if you have to stretch and go back to George Washington's 200th anniversary, that's all right too. Secondly, if you have some time, you're going to have a better result, right? If you start planning months in ahead or ideally years ahead, you're going to have a better idea, better event, especially in these days, than if you just kind of a month before go, hey, we should put something together. And then, again, the idea here about the Great Depression is happening. If you can form this on an idea that brings people to Wausa, brings in tourism, and helps the local economy, that's going to be an easier sell as well. And so with these lessons in hand, in 1935, they create a Wausa Centennial Association, which is a whole nonprofit. They have offices in one of the buildings downtown, and they're starting to get to work getting ready for an important anniversary that's coming up. It's a 100-year anniversary. You might wonder what this is for. Well, just so happens the following year, 1936, The U.S. signs a treaty 100 years ago with the Menominee, which gives that plot of land from basically kind of like the Brokaw area down to Trap River and beyond on the Wisconsin River, from the Menominee to the U.S. government, which paves the way. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, they didn't celebrate that. What they were celebrating was looking even further ahead to George Stevens Mill being set up in 1839. So they're 4 years ahead. I don't mean to say that that wasn't important, the treaty, but they certainly weren't like making a big deal out of it. And I don't know that they even recognized that as being an anniversary. Missed opportunity. Oh well, a little late to go back and suggest. So, George Stevens Mill at Big Bull Falls. This is not only the first settlement on what becomes Wausau, but it is the first settlement on the county. So, this is not just a local Wausau thing, this is going to be a wider thing. And for this, we need to talk about Carl Matthey for a second. Matthey is a fascinating figure, and I think at some point we'll have to come back and talk about him and do a whole program on him. And his family. He comes from the brewery business. His father was a brewer on Grand Avenue. But he goes a different direction. He decides to go into education, and then he gets into business as the paper company down in Mosinee. He gets involved in that. He's a politician. He's a public policy civil servant. He goes around and involved in reform and all sorts of stuff. And at this point, he is living in Wausau, and in 1936, after the Centennial Association gets formed, they bring him on to be in charge of the efforts to collect the history. This is through the WPA, the New Deal, the alphabet organization that they had. One of those was there was money from the federal government to, put people to work, not just artists painting murals or young men digging ditches and building roads in the CCC. They also put to work historians and academics. And so Carl gets put in charge of a group of people that are going to collect the history. And this is important because in the days before, we had a historical society. And I should say, make just quick aside here, the State Historical Society, the Wisconsin Historical Society, has already existed for a long time at this point. But just like today, they don't get up to talk about Marathon County very often. It's kind of easy just to kind of gloss over that and focus on what's local. That's not necessarily, I don't want to be, it's not condemning, like, oh, how dare you not come up and talk about us. But, a little of that. I don't think there'd be a whole lot about Marathon County, certainly not what they need to know to do a nice celebration. And so, again, because we don't have a local repository of this knowledge, they can't just go to the local history museum and say, all right, when did this happen? Or how long has this been happening? They need to figure that out themselves. It's pioneering the groundwork. So one thing they do, for example, is they do a census of the city of Wausau. Now, this is actually only sent to the graduates of the Wausau High School. So it's not like every citizen in the city gets this, but it covers a good number of people. And, we just want to know, who are you? Where did you go after high school? What do you do? How many kids do you have? Where do you live? Any remarks? And they do a lot of this sort of stuff. Now, unfortunately, Matthey really becomes the center of this. I mean, not unfortunately that he is. It's unfortunate that even though he becomes the center of this organization, this movement, he passes away about a couple months before the actual celebration. He's out in California on vacation, and he has a sudden health complication and he dies. But his friends and his colleagues take this forward and they continue after all. And in 1939, we have a big old celebration, the Centennial of Wausau. One of the sort of marquee events was this pageant that they put on. This is at Marathon Park. I colorized this picture. I just love this picture, which was supposed to be the first election in Wausau or in Marathon County. But there were other bits too. It was also patriotic, as you can see by these costumes, lots of red, white, and blue. I was thinking I should colorize this picture. This is interesting because I think that they would have been red and red capes. Maybe blue blouses and collars, and then white scarf. White, red, white, and blue, right? But yeah, let's celebrate who we are, where we come from. This is not just because the Revolutionary War kicks off or George Washington is born. This is a local story, but we're still gonna be proud of who we are, and that means national significance too. And of course, you have a parade. I always have to have a parade with these things. Also, some kind of weird stuff that happens, like, for example, this wooden nickel. And you might be saying that doesn't look like a nickel, that looks like it's like a bill. And that's true. It is a bill. It's cut to be like a dollar bill, but it's called a wooden nickel. I don't know. But this was a souvenir, and as you can see, the logo for the event still prominently holds Rib Mountain to be a big deal there too. But in terms of the historiography, we're talking about writing the history down. All that work that went into making that, the highlights of a century feature event and everything else that happened. They also published some stuff. So this is one collection of essays that were written as a result of this work, the history of Wausau. And so you can see points of interest, leisure hours, rural regions, government and politics, the schools, arts and letters, and the newspapers. And then also E.B. Thayer did a sort of a general history of the community. In addition, they also had exhibits. Back in '32 for the homecoming, they had put on a very successful, exhibition of some interesting old objects that they had put together. And in 1939, not only was there an official one, but they also had, the American Legion had a little display that they had in a storefront. And, the Ladies' Aid Society for, the St. Mary's Church had one, and et cetera. But the main one was hoped to be the start of, they weren't just thinking, let's just have an event and let's, have a big party for the city of Wausau and for the county. They wanted this to be the start of something greater. So they wanted this collection to be the seed of a museum of history. Well, it kind of did, but it was a long about way to do this. It ended up after the centennial, it went to the public library for a little while. They had it on display for a bit, but then, space issues, they ended up moving away from that. And then it goes to the city hall for a bit, but that just kind of gets put in storage. And eventually, in the 1950s, when the Marathon County Historical Society gets founded in '52, and then we get the Yawkey House, the old home that becomes the Historical Society in '54, '55. This becomes the core of our collection, and it's only grown from there. Not to say that that's why we exist, but that certainly helped out once we get started. So the other thing I want to talk about, if we're talking about like stuff that gets written about local history, obviously we talked a lot about Wausau, which has the biggest population center, kind of makes sense. But there are other centennials that pop up in the aftermath of this successful 1939 celebration. Marathon City, Mosinee, Weston, and Stettin from like 1957 to 1960. And then along the western edge of the county, you get all of the railroad towns that pop up in the 70s, the 1870s. And so you had centennials for Unity, Dorchester, Colby, and Spencer. I don't know why there's a 12-year gap. I think it's just because that's how it works out. Centennials are going to be an important reason for these books. And these books are, they vary in terms of the quality to the extent of like sometimes there's somebody that writes down all the history in one voice. Sometimes it's just a collection of just whatever people locally want to throw in there. Sometimes there's pictures. Sometimes there's, reproduced articles from newspapers or from like Louis Marchetti gets quoted a lot because he did a lot of the legwork. And it varies, but it's all from the local community, which is important. And this continues. The next big event that kind of influences this and kind of breaks the centennial mode is the American Revolution Bicentennial Project. This project started back in 1966. It had 10 years to get ready for the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the start of the America as a country. Revolutionary War kicks off with the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So we're going to celebrate that. And again, you can see the impulse to go, hey, that's history, that's important. But also, let's try to bring it back to the local histories. Because, honestly, there's not a lot, it's great to go over the big revolutionary events in Boston or Philadelphia, but there's not a whole lot in Wisconsin. But that's not the point. It's about, focusing on the local communities. And so just over the span of 1976 to 1978, about there, all of these are published, again, books, local booklets about these communities, and they all have this logo in it. It's part of this celebration. As it happens, Hamburg and Spencer also happen to be centennials, but that just kind of not the whole thing. And then we do also have for that, in addition to doing this, the and again, this is a whole topic that we can get back to and maybe revisit in the future, and probably will next year at some point. But the bicentennial also, we did oral interviews, we had a big party. There's more to it as well. But one of the things that comes out of that is sort of an update here of Marchetti's book, the history of the county, and now Woodlot and Ballot Box was designed to be sort of an updating of that for the whole county. And then since then, centennials are often the reason that we have more books. And these are from our collection. I apologize if I've missed any, but these are sort of the major ones from 1980 to the present. And they're all centennials or sesquicentennials or, something like that. 100 years, 150, 125. There's a couple that are like 101, which, yeah, that can happen. Maybe the delay coming out is part of that. The only one that isn't, that as far as I know, is Hatley. Is the only one that was just published because they wanted to. I think there might have been another one, actually. I think maybe Athens. Point is, I think centennials, in terms of the historiography, these are all, again, same sort of thing. Some of these are nice published books with like hardcovers. Some of them are just kind of photocopied, put in a binder, stapled together. But they are the product of the local communities coming together and saying, hey, this is important. We're turning 100 or 150 or whatever. We should collect this stuff. And it's part of the wider tapestry that is Marathon County and its people. Yeah. So why are they important? I mean, I think for that reason, right? Whether it is, in the 1950s or the last 2017, Town of Wien was, I think, the last one that we have in our collection. These are attempts to try to document what we have locally, and I think that that's an important and great thing. I don't always like anniversaries. I think that it's kind of hard to nail things down, and I don't know. Part of me is the curmudgeon in me says like, well, why do you have to wait to be 100 in order to celebrate a community? But it honestly is a really good thing because it gets interest and people want to join in and learn and tell stories. And so for that, that's pretty cool. And part of the reason that I'm doing this is because it just so happens that the city of Wausau is turning 150 next year. And so we're getting ready to, start putting some events together, and that'll be a theme of next year, I'm sure, for a lot of what we do. So you can look forward to that. I don't think we're announcing anything quite yet, but more on that soon. Including, by the way, I guess just to wrap things up here, hold on, let me restart here. So next week, this is usually where I tell you about what's going to happen next week. Next week is January 30th, so we're not going to be here. But I'm going to later this afternoon tape something with our events curator, Cheryl DeConti, and we'll talk a little bit about what's coming up in 2022, some of the stuff you can look forward to, and we'll play that next week. So there will be something next week, but this is the last live sort of history chats that we are doing this year. So yeah, I'll check if anybody had any comments. I'm gonna go take a look in a second here. But I just want to say thanks for watching this year. It's been a fun. I really enjoy putting these together. I think it's been a tough year. I think a tough couple years for a lot of us. And for me, this getting to put this together and share some local history has been something that's kind of kept me going this past year. And I really appreciate you guys tuning in and watching and letting us do this. And hopefully you've been enjoying it. We're going to keep coming back for next year. We have plans to continue this, of course, through 2022. So that'll be the plan. Anyway, just give me a second to see if any comments. Okay, no comments. That's all right. I know I went a little late. Apologize for that. But, yeah. Anyway, so I think I'll then maybe call it here then. Thanks again for watching. Yeah, we'll see you. Have a happy holidays for everybody. See you next year for the next live history chats, and we'll let you know what's coming up next year, next week. So yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time. I know I said that already, but I feel like I need to say something before I end. So